The summer Vera Caulfield walked into that courthouse meeting with 44 acres of John Songgrass and a decision the whole of Dunbar County was waiting on. The heat sat on the building like a debt nobody intended to pay. People had driven in from the outlying precincts, from the Dry Creek hollows and the cracked hardpan spreads east of the Mineral Fork Road, and they filled the folding chairs and lined the back wall 3 deep, and the room smelled of sweat and desperation and the particular bitterness of men who have been wrong about something for a long time and know it. Vera stood at the front near the county assessor's table, her hat in her hands, her forearms the color of saddle leather, and the crowd watched her the way crowds watch a person who has lately become inconvenient to their understanding of the world. Someone had propped the tall windows open with tobacco sticks, but no breeze came through. A single box fan turned in the corner and moved the same hot air around in a slow, useless circle. Oh. Harlan Creed sat in the front row in his seersucker suit and his smile that never reached his eyes, and he had a legal pad on his knee and a pen in his hand, and he looked like a man who had already written the ending of the story and was only waiting for the rest of the room to catch up. He had underestimated her for nearly 2 years. Most of them had. The land had not. The land had been paying attention the whole time, holding what it held, remembering what the farmers before her had forgotten to see, whispering in the language of root and stone and slope that you either learned to hear or you did not. Vera had learned. She had spent the better part of 19 months learning nothing else. And now the room waited on her, and the only thing left to determine was what a woman who had been given nothing but hard clay and mockery intended to do with the moment she had made. The real verdict, though, had been passed long before that room filled up. It had been passed the previous October, in a silence so complete you could hear a hog breathe 20 yards away. And the judge of it had been neither Harlan Creed, nor the county commissioner, nor any of the people in those folding chairs. But that is where this story arrives, and to understand what happened there, you have to go back to the beginning of it, which was a cold Tuesday in late November. 2 years prior, when Vera Caulfield drove a rusted flatbed truck down a gravel access road and stopped at the edge of 44 acres of the worst-looking land in Dunbar County, and got out and stood in the wind and looked at what she had bought. She had come from the eastern part of the state, from a rented house and a job in a county extension office that paid her $31,000 a year and offered her exactly nothing in the way of a future. She had no family in Dunbar County, no contacts, no references that counted for anything in a place where roots meant the roots of families and not the extension of some land management credential. She had $9,000 in savings, which was what remained after she paid the back taxes on the 44 acres at the county tax sale, the sale being the mechanism by which the county divested itself of land that nobody had paid taxes on in 7 years, which tells you something about what the land was considered to be worth. The prior owner had died without heirs and without a will, and the county had held the parcel for the statutory period and then put it up for $2,200 in back taxes owed, which was such an obviously bad bargain that only Vera had bid on it. The auctioneer had looked up from his sheet when she raised her hand, more out of surprise than procedure, and someone in the back had said something, and there had been a low, collective sound, not quite laughter, more like the audible expression of a community reaching a shared conclusion about a stranger's judgment. Wanver had written the check and taken the deed and driven out the same afternoon to see what she had purchased. What she had purchased was 44 acres of John Songgrass, so dense and so deep-rooted that you could lean against it like a wall, so dense. John Songgrass, which is to a crop farmer what a slow fire is to a barn, which spreads by rhizome underground in a network as deliberate and patient as any plan which had been taking that land back to its own purposes for at least 2 decades, judging by the depth of the root mat. There was a tilted board-and-batten structure at the eastern end that had been a hayshed and was now more of a geometry problem than a building, its roof having achieved a 30-degree list to the south that suggested the next moderate windstorm would settle the philosophical question of whether it still counted as standing. A shallow pond collected in the northwest corner or a natural swale ran off the adjacent ridge, and the water in it was the color of iron and smelled faintly of sulfur. There were no utilities to speak of. There was a hand-dug well near the shed that the county surveyor's notes described as seasonal, which is a polite way of saying unreliable. Vera walked the perimeter of the 44 acres in the November wind, and she did the arithmetic in her head the way she had trained herself to do. Not the arithmetic of what the land was now, but the arithmetic of what it could carry. And she arrived at a number that was uncertain enough to frighten her, and not so impossible as to send her back to the truck. She had $6,800 left, after subtracting the tax payment of $2,200, the cost of the drive out, and the first month's rent on a room in town at Mrs. Pinero's boarding house, where the walls were thin and the radiator knocked, and the other boarders worked at the grain elevator and regarded her with the flat uncuriosity of men who see what they expect to see and nothing more. The next week she spent $4,200 on 8 Ossabaw Island hogs at $525 a head, a breed so old and so ignored by the modern pork industry that the man she bought them from, a breeder 2 counties north, had seemed briefly, genuinely moved that anyone had come for them at all. He was an old man with a face like a worn-out boot, and he told her the Ossabaw was descended from stock the Spanish had left on a Georgia sea island 4 centuries ago, that they were smaller than commercial hogs and slower to finish and produced a fat so densely marbled and so rich in oleic acid of a confinement operation. He told her the fat was the whole point. She had nodded and loaded 8 of them into a borrowed trailer and driven them south to 44 acres of John Songgrass that everyone in Dunbar County already agreed were worthless. The first person in town to comment on this, loudly and in public, was Dale Overbeck, who ran a 400-head cow-calf operation on the good bottomland east of the Mineral Fork, and who was the kind of man whose prosperity had calcified into an opinion about everything. He made his remark at the hardware store on a Saturday morning when Vera was buying wire staples and corner braces to begin fencing the perimeter. And the remark was specifically that a woman alone with 8 junk hogs on a John Songgrass patch was like a man trying to put out a house fire with a coffee cup, by which he meant, she supposed, that the scale of her problem relative to her resources was comic. The men at the counter had laughed. Vera had paid for her staples and left because being right is its own kind of reply. And the reply only has to be delivered once, and the time for it was not yet. 2 weeks after she fenced the first 10 acres and turned the Ossabaws in, a man appeared at the gate in a white pickup truck with a consortium logo on the door. His name was Harlan Creed, and he was what he appeared to be at first glance, which was a corporate land aggregator of the type that had been working through the hill counties of that region for several years, consolidating parcels into large holdings for a Midwestern investment group whose name appeared in small print on the consortium's website and meant nothing to anyone who did not follow that particular corner of agricultural finance. He was smooth and well-dressed, and his handshake was warm, and his offer was $2,900 for the 44 acres, which was $700 more than she had paid in back taxes, and which he presented as a generous gesture towards someone who had clearly made a mistake. He said the word kindly with the specific inflection of a man who has decided that kindness and condescension are the same instrument. Vera told him the land was not for sale. He left a card. He drove back to town, and she did not know it. But he drove directly to the county assessor's office and requested copies of her deed, her tax payment records, and the plat survey. And she would not know that he had done this until much later, when it became important. She spent December and January doing what the arithmetic required, which was surviving. She bought hay for 2 months at a price that made the arithmetic ugly, and she repaired the hay shed with salvaged tin and used lumber she traded for by helping a neighbor clear a fence line, and she drew water from the seasonal well twice a day in a routine that left her hands cracked and her shoulders permanently sore. The Ossabaws rooted in the cold John Songgrass with a patience and a thoroughness that seemed almost philosophical working the root mat up in sections and consuming what they turned. And she watched this and tried to understand what she was watching, which was, she was beginning to believe, a more productive process than it appeared on the surface. Johnsongrass rhizomes carry starch reserves, which the hogs could access and digest, and the overturned earth exposed to the winter cold killed portions of the root network that had been insulated under the mat, and the hog manure, which was considerable, began composting into the broken ground at a rate she tried to calculate and could not quite believe. She had not expected the hogs to work so systematically. She had expected chaos, and she got instead something that resembled, very slowly, a plan. She nearly lost 2 of the hogs in February when the temperature dropped to 9 degrees for 4 consecutive nights, and the makeshift shelters she had built proved inadequate. She spent those nights in the hayshed, wrapped in a blanket she had brought from Mrs. Das. Pinero's burning scrap wood in a cut-down barrel, watching the hogs huddle in their bedding and doing the arithmetic of loss, which in this case was the arithmetic of 8 animals purchased at $525 each, and what the subtraction of 2 would mean to the spring. The hogs survived. She had made the shelters deeper and packed them with more straw than she thought necessary, and it had been barely enough. She drove back to town in the gray February morning, and bought coffee at the diner and sat by the window, and 2 men in the booth behind her were talking about her, not knowing she was there. And one of them said something about the Johnsongrass lady, and the other laughed and said that land would be a Harlan Creed holding by summer at the price of a decent dinner. Vera drank her coffee and left the exact amount of the bill in coins on the table and walked out into the cold. It was in March that Emmett Szabo appeared. He was her neighbor to the north, 73 years old, born in a village in central Hungary that no longer existed, by the name he knew it. And he had farmed his 80 acres for 31 years by methods that the County Extension Service had politely but consistently described as unconventional, which was another polite word for things that worked, but that the fashionable expertise of the moment had not yet ratified. He came to her gate one morning, leading a mule. He was moving between pastures, and he looked at the hogs, working the upturned ground for a long time without saying anything. And then he said, in the soft, accented cadence that was his own particular instrument, a thing that she would carry with her for the rest of her time on that land. He said, a seed knows more about this ground than you and I combined, and the ground knows more than the seed, and what the hog knows is something else again, which is where to begin. Then he said that the prior owner of that 44 acres had, 60 years ago, grown grain sorghum on the southern half and had operated a small mill for custom grinding, and that the mill had been buried or collapsed sometime in the 1972nd, and that the soil in that southern section was consequently having been dressed with sorghum residue for 2 decades, and that if she let the hogs work from the north down to the south, she would find, in the ground, something worth finding. He said this the way old people say things they are confident about, quietly and without drama. And then he led his mule along the fence line and was gone. And Vera stood for a moment with the morning light on her face, and then she turned and looked at the southern end of her property, the way you look at a thing you have been seeing without understanding it. She adjusted the rotation. She moved the hogs systematically, section by section, from north to south, which was the direction Emmett Szabo had indicated, which was also, she noticed once she began paying closer attention, the direction the natural drainage of the land ran, following the old topography of the field, as it had been shaped by cultivation rather than by accident. She began keeping notes. She noted which sections the hogs returned to voluntarily when given the choice, which was information. If you believe that animals carry knowledge of the ground in their behavior, she noted the change in the rooted soil, which became darker and denser as they moved south. The old sorghum residue still present in the microbiology, if not in visible form. She noted that one of the hogs, the patriarch of the group, a boar of perhaps 3 years with an outsized dark head, and a patience that bordered on the monumental, consistently worked the southern fence line with a specific focused attention that was different from foraging. She had named him nothing yet. She named him after watching him work the southern fence for 3 consecutive mornings. She named him Emmett. By May, the northern 20 acres of John Songgrass were substantially broken, a transformation invisible to anyone who drove past on the county road and saw only a fence line and some hogs, but visible to her in the quality of the ground, and in the arithmetic of it, which had quietly, over 4 months of cold weather and daily labor and nearly 8 tons of manure, composted into the broken root mat, begun to look less like a problem and more like a resource. The John Songgrass itself, she had understood by March, was not the enemy. John Songgrass is the enemy only if your goal is a conventional row crop and your method is dominance, in which case it will beat you every time because it has 4 centuries of practice and root systems deeper than your patience. If your goal is something different, the John Songgrass is simply an enormous stored quantity of organic material and nitrogen, and 8 Ossabaw Island hogs are an engine for converting it into something a seed can use. She had stopped fighting the grass. She had, as Emmett Shabo had suggested she would, let the hogs do what their nature intended, and what their nature intended was, it turned out, more useful than anything she could have arranged by force. In June, a young boy named Cody Pruitt began appearing at the fence line after school. He was 10 years old, and he lived with his grandmother half a mile down the county road in a house that needed painting, and whose propane tank, she had noticed, was always less than half full. He was a quiet child, with observant eyes and a serious way of holding himself that had nothing of childhood performance in it, only the economy of a child who has learned not to waste attention. He never asked to come in. He stood at the fence and watched the hogs work, and one afternoon she opened the gate and he walked in without comment and stood beside her and watched Emmett the boar work the ground near the south fence, and after a long time the boy said, "He knows something is down there." Vera said yes. The boy came back the next day and the day after that, and by the end of the first week he was carrying water buckets with her in the morning before school, and had given names to all 8 of the hogs without being invited to, and the names were specific and apt in the way that children's observations about animals sometimes are, seeing what adults talk themselves out of seeing. It was Cody who found the first stones of the old mill in late July, when Emmett and 2 of the sows had worked down to a depth of nearly 18 inches in the southern corner, and turned up worked sandstone blocks of a regularity that natural geology does not produce. Vera came and knelt in the dirt and looked at the stones, and then she stood up and looked at the whole southern portion of her 44 acres, and something that had been a hypothesis became a fact. There was a structure down there, buried under decades of silt and grass and the slow accumulation of a field reverting to itself, and the structure was on her land, and what was on her land was hers, and what it meant was not yet clear, but it was not nothing. She did not tell anyone. She banked it like a coal kept low under ash, not smothered but not burning openly, waiting for the moment that warranted the heat. She covered the exposed stones loosely with the turned earth, enough to obscure them from the road, and she went back to the daily arithmetic of survival, and said nothing about it to anyone in town, and nothing about it to Harlan Creed, who appeared again in August with a revised offer of $4,500, and the same smile that never reached his eyes, and who lingered at the gate longer than a man with no particular interest in the property would have, and who asked, with a casualness that was not casual, whether she had found anything interesting in the ground. A question so specific that she filed it in the same place. She filed the fact that Dale Overbeck had laughed at her in the hardware store, which was in the part of her mind where things are kept for later. She told him no. She watched his truck until it was gone from sight. Then she went back to the south field and looked at the ground above the buried stones, and stood there in the August heat and thought about what a man knows who ought not to know. What he asked her about, the thought was not comfortable. She carried it like a stone in a shoe for the rest of the summer. The drought arrived in September, the way Emmett Sabo had predicted it would, which was like the open door of a furnace, which was the exact phrase he used, standing at her fence one evening in August, watching the sky. He said the ground up on the ridge had a particular crack to it that he had seen before, in the summer of 1988 and again in 2012, and that what followed, both times, was a dry autumn of a severity that the conventional operations in the valley were not built to survive. He said this without drama, and with the mild precision of a man reporting the weather, and then he said a thing she would echo in her own mind many times in the months to come, which was that a farm that listens to the ground will eat, when a farm that fights the ground will starve. She had written this down in her notebook, not as a literary exercise but as a practical instruction, because everything Emmett Jabbo had told her so far had proven to be a practical instruction. By the second week of September, the creek at the Mineral Fork was running at a third of its normal late summer flow, which was already low. By the end of October, the creek was a series of disconnected pools. The grass in the conventional pastures had gone to dust and powder, and Dale Overbeck's 400-head cow-calf operation, which depended on Mineral Fork water rights, and on the assumption that the fall rains would come when they had always come, was hemorrhaging pasture by the week. The outlying spreads were worse. 3 families east of the county road sold stock at the sale barn in November at the kind of prices that represent not a market but a surrender, and the sale barn was busy, and the prices were low, and the faces of the men coming through the ring were the faces of people who had been right about everything for 20 years and had recently discovered being right about everything for 20 years was not the same as being prepared for the one thing that changed. Vera's hogs were not suffering. The broken, composted ground of the northern acres held moisture to a depth and a duration that the undisturbed hardpan of the surrounding farms did not, because broken organic matter holds water the way a sponge holds water rather than the way a clay tile holds water, and the Ossabaws, being a heritage breed adapted to foraging rather than confinement, could extract nutrition from ground that a commercial hog would starve on. She was buying supplemental feed, it was expensive, and the arithmetic was tight, but it was not desperate, and the hogs were not losing condition. She noted this in her book. She noted the contrast between her 44 acres, which looked poor and unremarkable from the road, and the surrounding operations, which looked prosperous until you looked at the water table and the pasture residue in the faces of the people running them. The outside validator arrived in October, 3 weeks before the drought reached its worst. He came as a cook, a young man who prepared food for a restaurant in the city to the north, and who was driving the county roads looking for heritage pork producers, following a tip from a network of small farmers he corresponded with and who appeared at her gate on a Tuesday morning with a card from the restaurant and a polite, direct manner and a willingness to stand in the wind while she decided whether to talk to him. His name was not important. What was important was that he looked at her 8 Ossabaws, particularly at Emmett the boar and the 3 sows of his line. And he said, with the authority of a man who has staked his professional reputation on the quality of fat, that what he was looking at was as good as anything he had seen from a producer east of the Mississippi. He offered her $8 a pound hanging weight for 4 animals when she was ready to finish them, which against the current market price of $2.20 a pound for commercial hogs represented a number that made the arithmetic of the next year look entirely different from the arithmetic of the year just past. She did not show the change in her face. She told him she would have animals ready in the spring, and he gave her his card, and she put it in her shirt pocket and thanked him, and he drove away, and she stood in the October wind, and the arithmetic of what had just happened ran through her mind 3 times until she was certain of it. That was the same week that Harlan Creed made his 3rd visit. He had apparently been informed by some channel that the drought was creating buying opportunities in Dunbar County, and he arrived at her gate with a new offer of $9,000 and a new manner that had less warmth in it than the previous visits, the warmth having been a tactic and the tactic having produced nothing. And what remained without it was a direct business-like pressure that had the character of a door being pushed open by someone who has decided to stop knocking. He said the consortium was acquiring additional acreage for a regional feedlot project, and that her 44 acres were well positioned for access, and that $9,000 represented a fair valuation for the parcel in its current condition. She asked him what he understood her current condition to be. He said the land was underdeveloped and had shown no productive revenue in the time she had held it. This was not accurate, and she noted the inaccuracy without correcting it. Because a man who has been watching your operation from a distance and has formed wrong conclusions about what he has observed is providing you with information about what he has and has not been able to see, which is its own kind of useful knowledge. She told him the land was not for sale. He said she should think carefully, given the season. She said she had thought carefully since November of the prior year, and that careful thinking was what had brought her to the conclusion that the land was not for sale. He left without the card, this time. She stood at the gate and watched the white truck until it turned onto the county road, and then she went back to work. Dale Overbeck appeared at her gate on a November morning, wearing a hat he had not thought to take off, which he removed after a moment with the slow deliberateness of a man engaging in an action he has rehearsed but still finds difficult. He was there because his own water source, the gravity-fed system from the upper creek, had gone dry for the first time in his memory, and he had 230 head of calves that needed water and no reasonable way to get it to them at the distance and the scale required, and he had heard from his wife, who had heard it from Mrs. Wire. Pinero, who had heard it from Cody Pruitt's grandmother, that Vera Caulfield's hogs were watered from a source that had not gone dry. This was true. The well in the northwest corner of her property, the seasonal well the county surveyor had described as unreliable, was drawing from the same perched aquifer that the natural swale and the pond in the northwest corner collected from. And because the 44 acres had been broken and composted for 11 months, more of the autumn's negligible rainfall had infiltrated rather than running off, and the aquifer was holding better than any surface source in the county. She did not have water to spare, but she had water, and Dale Overbeck was standing at her gate without his hat and asking, in a voice that had had most of the bluster pressed out of it by circumstance. She told him what she could give him and at what frequency, and what she needed from him in return, which was not money but labor, specifically the use of his truck and his time for 1 day per week through the dry period, which she needed for hauling feed. He agreed without bargaining. He seemed almost grateful to be given terms that were reasonable. He said after a moment in which he appeared to be locating something that had been misplaced, that he had spoken poorly at the hardware store the prior year. She said she remembered. He put his hat back on, and they shook hands. And he came back that afternoon with his truck, and they began. Then came the meeting at the courthouse, which was called by the county commissioner at Harlan Creed's request, framed as an emergency water resource planning session, which was the civic and legal mechanism by which Creed's consortium intended to establish a claim over the water access that several farms in the eastern precinct depended on, and that certain county road right-of-way provisions might, under a particular legal interpretation, allow a private entity to regulate. It was a sophisticated maneuver. The drought had created the emergency, and the emergency had created the pretext. And the pretext was the open door through which a consortium with legal resources could walk while the people in the folding chairs were still trying to understand what had happened. 23 families in Dunbar County stood to be materially affected by the water rights question, and Harlan Creed sat in the front row with his legal pad and his pen and his smile and waited for Vera Caulfield to speak because she had been granted the floor first by virtue of being the party who held the relevant deed. She spoke plainly. She said that the aquifer under the northwest corner of her 44 acres was accessible by a well on private property, and that the water from it had been shared with her neighbor Dale Overbeck and with the Pruitt family at no charge other than labor exchange, and that she intended to continue sharing it at no charge through the dry season, and that what she did with water on her own land was her own determination to make. She said that in the prior August, Mr. Boldy, Creed had asked her whether she had found anything interesting in the ground on her property, and that at the time she had not known how he had come to know there might be something to find, since she had not told anyone, and that it had since come to her attention through the county surveyor's re-inspection that she had commissioned in October. that the southern parcel boundary of the consortium's adjacent acquisition showed surveyors' marks that postdated her own purchase by only weeks, marks that corresponded precisely to the location of the buried mill structure on her land, a structure whose existence she had not publicly disclosed. She said that a man who knows where your buried mill is when you have told no one about it is a man who has been on your property without invitation, which is a trespass, and that a man who then appears with purchase offers at progressively higher prices and who subsequently pursues civic legal mechanisms to control water access on which your operation depends is demonstrating a pattern that she suspected the county commissioner might find worth examining. The room was quiet. Harlan Creed's pen had stopped moving on the legal pad. The county commissioner, who was a cautious man named Howell, and who had an election in 11 months and a solid instinct for which direction the wind was blowing, looked at Creed with the expression of a man who has just noticed a smell he cannot account for. Someone in the back of the room coughed. The box fan turned in the corner. Creed said that her claims were speculative. She said she had the surveyor's report, dated and notarized, with the correspondence of measurements, and that she was content to let the county commissioner review it and form his own judgment. She put the document on the assessor's table. She said that the water from her well was available to anyone in the county who needed it through the dry season at a price of no dollars, on the condition that they send one person for 1 hour of labor per week to help maintain the well casing and the distribution equipment, which she had rigged from salvage, and that this arrangement was not a charity but a fair exchange of what she had for what she needed, and that it was open to anyone except a party that had entered her property without permission and had used what it found there to build a scheme against her. She looked at Harlan Creed when she said this. The room looked at Harlan Creed. He did not say anything. He looked at his legal pad, and the legal pad did not help him. After a moment he closed the pad and capped the pen and stood up and walked out through the side door without speaking to anyone. And the sound of his footsteps on the wooden floor was the only sound in the room, until the door closed behind him, and then someone in the middle rows began to remove his hat, and then someone else, and by the time the commissioner called the meeting formally to order, there were 11 hats off in that room, and Vera Caulfield was no longer the woman alone who had bought the John Songras acres at the tax sale. The rains came in December, first as a week of cold drizzle that moved through from the northwest, then as a genuine, soaking rain that lasted 3 days, and ran the mineral fork up to its banks, and refilled the ponds on the eastern precinct spreads, and covered the county in the particular gray-green that follows the end of a drought, the color of something that had not died, but had been close, and now remembered what living required. The ground on Vera's 44 acres, which had been broken and composted and managed for 13 months, took the rain differently from the surrounding land, holding it deeper and releasing it more slowly. And when the spring came, the southern 20 acres, where the buried millstones lay and where the old sorghum soil had been feeding the root systems of the John Songras, and now the compost of 13 months of hog labor showed a tilth and a color that you could see from the county road if you knew what you were looking at, which Emmett Chabot did, coming to her gate in March with the mule again, and standing for a long time looking at the field. He said the ground was talking. She said she was learning to hear it. He said that the thing about ground that has been worked right is that it does not forget, and that the old sorghum farmer, whoever he had been, had worked it right 70 years ago, and that the hogs had found what was there and opened it up again, and that what she had now was not a fixed and finished thing, but a conversation that would continue for as long as she was willing to carry her end of it. He said this in the same quiet cadence, as always, looking at the field, and then he looked at her and said, "And the ground does not forget who listened. Cody Pruitt was there." He had come in the morning before school to help with the water, which he still did, although the well was no longer anyone's emergency, and he was standing near the gate with a feed bucket, and one of the younger sows had her nose through the fence near his hand, and he was talking to her in the private conversational way he talked to all of them, and the field was green behind him in the March light, and the buried millstones were still there under the southern ground where the hogs had found them and where Vera had decided, over the winter, that they would stay for now, kept there like a record, like a message left by the land for anyone patient enough to dig through what was covering it. She had taken photographs and registered the find with the County Historical Society, which had expressed polite interest and then gone quiet about it, which was fine. She was not in a hurry. Hurry had never been part of her method. The arithmetic of the spring was different from the arithmetic of the previous November, in the way that things look different when the numbers finally agree with what you believed was possible. 4 of the Osaba hogs had gone to the restaurant at $8 a pound hanging weight, which came to $11,320 net, from which she had subtracted the feed cost and the transport cost, and what remained was enough to retire the emergency loans she had taken in December, and to buy materials for a permanent well, casing, and to begin in a modest and practical way the restoration of the buried mill, not as a working operation, but as the foundation of something she had not fully named yet. She had 4 hogs remaining, and 2 of the sows were in pig, and Emmett the boar stood in the south field in the March light with his great dark head, and his patience that bordered on the monumental, and she looked at him from the gate, and thought that he had known something was down there from the beginning, which was either animal instinct or animal intelligence, and she was no longer sure the distinction was meaningful. He had worked toward the mill from the first week. The land had told him, and he had listened, and she had watched him long enough to understand what he was doing, and that chain of attention and translation, from the ground to the animal to her, was what had made the difference. It was what Emmett Sabo had told her it would be, in the slow aphoristic language of someone who has had decades to move from knowing to understanding. A seed knows more about this ground than you and I combined, and the ground knows more than the seed, and what the hog knows is something else again, which is where to begin. She had learned to hear it. She stood at the gate of her 44 acres in the March morning. Dunbar County spread out around her, green and recovering, the mineral fork running full again behind the ridge, Cody Pruitt talking to a hog by the fence, Emmett Shabo walking his mule back up the north road, the field behind her dark and rich and patient and entirely without argument. Hers, not because she had beaten anyone or forced anything, but because she had paid attention when attention was what the ground required. Not because the community had given it to her, but because she had earned the belonging 1 day of arithmetic and 1 day of labor, at a time, in the cold and the heat and the mockery and the drought, and all the long months, when the only verdict that mattered was the one the land was quietly, continuously passing, and which she had been, from the first morning, trying to deserve.
Faire ma télé sur Sakura et le téléphone avec toi. OK. Je suis un peu perdue ce soir-là. Eh ben écoute, on va lancer Fortnite, hein, parce que je crois qu'on est que 2 à vouloir jouer, en fait. Alors attendez, putain, j'ai 150 000 fenêtres d'ouvertes. Pam, pam, pam. Ça ici. Ça, c'est Epic Games. OK.